we find it critically important to have thinkers who think in that very practical, grounded and realistic way, but with a sense of what the future might potentially look like. So it's in that context that it's my pleasure, my great pleasure, to introduce Professor Ross Garnaut. Again, I'm sure that anyone who's been paying any attention to climate policy in Australia over the last 20 years would know a great deal about Ross. So again, let me just simply fill out what is an exceptionally publicly recognised biography. Ross is an economist. He's an emeritus professor in business and economics and the Vice Chancellor's professorial fellow at this university. Over the past 50 years, he's had several distinguished careers as a principal economic advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke from 1983 to 1985. Then as a diplomat, he was Australia's ambassador to China from 1985 to 1988. As an academic and as a public intellectual, especially on climate-related matters, for which he's received the Companion of the Order of Australia, the AC, in 2017 for his work on climate change and energy. He's the author of numerous publications, including scholarly articles and books. The two Garnaut Climate Review reports, in particular the one in 2007, then the update in 2011, propelled Australia's debate around pricing carbon and also opened up the discussion around what was ultimately an ill-fated attempt to establish the CPRS, the Climate Pollution Reduction Scheme, and a national emissions trading scheme. More recently, Ross has written very realistically about the need for restoring Australia after the pandemic recession in a book called Reset, published last year, and about Australia's prospects in a decarbonised world in two very important books on Australia as a clean energy superpower, including his new book, Superpower Transformation, Building the Australian Zero Carbon Opportunity, in which he discusses why being a climate leader, a global climate leader, is in Australia's national interest. And I've got to say, the books are going to be available out there for you to buy in multiple copies with Ross signing them, I hope. It's my great pleasure and honour to introduce Ross and welcome him.
Thanks, Peter, Vice Chancellor, Jackie there. In acknowledging the Indigenous owners of this land, just recall that I dedicated the book 3 years ago, Superpower, Australia's Low Carbon Opportunity, to Indigenous Australians on whose land the superpower would be built. The story I told in Superpower 3 years ago was one of Australia having exceptional endowments for producing low-cost, zero-emissions energy and also absorbing carbon in the landscape, and that would play a very large role in the global transition to zero-emissions economy. And nearly all of the activity would be in rural and provincial Australia, a very large part of it on land where we now acknowledge Indigenous roles in leadership and management. And so we will get there through leadership and management by Australian Indigenous communities. It's been a theme of my recent work over recent years that Australia has not done so well in recent years because we've downgraded the role of knowledge in our society and in policy making. Knowledge is the foundation of good economic policy in a democracy. It's the foundation of sound international relations. It's the foundation of sound climate policy. And over the last couple of decades, the last decade in particular, we've systematically downgraded the role of knowledge, and climate skepticism or denial is part of a wider problem. We're going to have to correct that if we're to deal with any of the big problems of our times, problems of growing inequality, problems of stagnation of living standards over the past decade, living standards of ordinary Australians. The elite's done well enough. And the big problems of climate, big problems of international relations and war. Restoring the role of knowledge is going to be very important to our success. And of course, that's what a university is all about. With our Vice-Chancellor, with his background at Cambridge here, I recall that in the book Superpower, I remembered that when I was giving the Colin Clark lecture at the University of Queensland a dozen years ago, Clark being one of the great early Australian economists, I reread his early work, and in 1942 he wrote Conditions for Economic Progress, and something I hadn't noticed when I first read that as a student, but jumped out at me at the page reading it 10 years ago. He said, we've done quite well in the industrial age burning coal, but there's a lot more coal being put under the earth by photosynthesis in the last billion years than we're near using, but we can't use all of it, or we will destabilize a lot of conditions on Earth. Colin Clark had come to Australia from Cambridge, from a chemistry background, actually, but made his career as an economist. A lot of it working for the Queensland government. Peter, in his introductory remarks, said that if we are very ambitious, do things very well, we might avoid the worst outcomes. I'd be more positive than that, Peter. I'd say that the opportunity is still there for us to, of course, not to avoid a lot of damage. That's already happening from climate change, and more is going to happen. But making the effort to hold global temperature increases within 1.5 degrees matters enormously. The difference it makes between doing that and slipping half or 1 degrees is huge, and we can do it. And we'll be more prosperous as a society. We'll be more secure as an international community if we do it. Seeing that there's everything going for it, we might as well do it. And that's been the theme of my recent work. I've we just launched yesterday the sequel to the book Superpower, the Superpower Transformation. It's based on careful research, mainly people associated with the University of Melbourne and my former colleagues at the ANU in Canberra. And it fills out the story of Superpower Australia's low carbon opportunity. 3 years ago, I spoke about how mainly technological changes, but also increased understanding of aspects of how the economy works in this area were shifting what had been a costly solution to the climate change problem, but one that we had to do because it was even more costly not to deal with it, into a new type of problem, one in which if we move quickly and deeply into the transformation, we would be richer earlier as a consequence. It's always very large adjustment costs and problems associated with any change, but our understanding of the economics and the technology had advanced enough between early in the century and 2019 for me to be able to say with confidence that there was no economic benefit in putting off that adjustment. We had to make it sooner or later. Doing it sooner would make us richer sooner, as well as contributing to the global solution to the climate problem. The 1.5 degree goal was articulated more clearly and strongly at the Glasgow meeting of the Conference of the Parties of the UN. Paris had talked about holding temperature increases below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5. At Glasgow, the focus was more unambiguously on the 1.5 degrees. All of the recent research here and in the rest of the world shows that it's within reach, and the work here has shown that what Australia does will actually have quite an important role in determining whether the world makes it. And there are a number of reasons for this. One reason is that on a finely balanced issue in which you've got discordant views on how much action should be taken and when, every player affects the global balance of the discussion. And we're not unimportant diplomatically in that balance. Historically, Australia from time to time has played important roles in international decisions. Some of these times for ill and some for good. We punched well above our weight a few times in history. We certainly did at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, where a young economist at the British Treasury wrote home to his friends in Bloomsbury that an ignorant Welshman leading Australia has just caused another war in Europe. And the teachers of Hirohito, the 19-year-old prince in Japan, were taught that defeat of the racial equality clause, Woodrow Wilson's clause at the peace conference, and the defeat was caused by Billy Hughes, the Australian Prime Minister. That defeat means that Japan will never be treated as an equal by the West without victory in war. We punched above our weight then. We punched above our weight in Glasgow, where our resistance to a number of important issues was quite important in blocking, especially President Biden's initiatives on zero emissions electricity generation by the mid-30s, and also on the methane pledge to reduce emissions by 30% in methane by 2030. But we've also punched above our weight in positive ways on important things, setting up the post-war international order in 45. Whether we're on the positive or the negative side of the big diplomatic issues does matter in a world in which debate on these things is often finely balanced. But it matters, Australia's position matters in another way as well. We are uniquely endowed in the world with resources that are important to a low-cost movement from a carbon-based economy to a zero emissions economy. And this was really the underlying theme of the book Superpower, and was realization of this between my original work for all the state premiers and the Prime Minister back in 2007, 2008, changes between then and my realization of underlying realities from about 2015 that led to the Superpower book. Australia has 5 huge advantages in the zero emission world economy, advantages over other countries, which gives us great opportunity, but also responsibility. First of these, of all the countries on Earth, we've got the best combinations of wind and solar resources for producing low-cost energy. When I was doing my original work, 2007, 2008, on the first climate change review, the director of the German solar energy program, then the biggest solar energy program in the world, came to see me, expressed unhappiness that his preparation for our meeting had told him that the best places in Germany for solar energy were worse than the west coast of Tasmania, which was the worst place in Australia. And we've got excellent wind alongside the solar that other places don't have it. In the zero emissions world, where we will all be relying mainly on solar and wind, some other zero emission sources of energy, that will make us, if we do things right, the low energy cost country of the world. That's going to be very important in other countries achieving zero emissions goals. The great steel producer of the world, China, producing more than half the world's steel, Japan, Korea, Germany, all countries with poor, relative to the size of the economy and population, poor endowments of natural resources for renewable energy. Also no land. For Australia to play its full part in the international adjustment to zero emissions, we're going to end up, I explain in my contribution to this volume, with about 36,000 square kilometres of solar panels, and that's 10 times a square of 60 kilometres. Well, there's nowhere in Japan or Germany or Korea or coastal China or central China where you can put 1/4 of a 60-kilometre square of solar panels. So it's not just the quality of the resources; it's the land to do it. And in the zero emissions world economy, it's going to be very difficult for those highly industrialized, densely populated countries to achieve zero emissions in industry. The cheapest way for them to do it will be for them to import zero emissions products, the early stages of processing of materials from other countries. And Germany will still make the Mercedes-Benzes and the Audis, but the zero emissions iron can come from Australia. A lot of the early work on that was done in research within the German-Australian Climate and Energy College based at the University of Melbourne. The $1 million grant from the Commonwealth government, to which was abolished as a budget-saving measure in a year in which the Commonwealth government ran a deficit of $100 billion. So that's an illustration of the priorities of Australia a few years ago, and hopefully, as Jackie and the Vice-Chancellor have said, priorities which have since changed. But that first advantage of the low cost of renewable energies is linked to a second one. Australia is by far the world's largest exporter of mineral materials that need a lot of energy in processing. We're by far the world's biggest exporter of iron oxide, iron ore, that currently is mainly converted into iron metal through use of coal as coke. In a zero emissions world, the low cost way of turning iron ore into metal will be to use hydrogen made from renewable energy for reduction. And this will be the low cost way of doing that. Australia will be a very big exporter of hydrogen and ammonia, and also of electrons, of electricity through submarine cables, but this is going to be very expensive. The energy at the other end in Singapore or Japan or China or Germany is going to be more than twice as expensive as in Australia. That's unlike the world of coal or gas, where natural gas, methane, where international transport costs tend to be low, especially for coal as a proportion of total value. So it's just as cheap, sometimes cheaper, to use the Australian coal in another country for processing. But iron ore, we're by far the world's biggest exporter of aluminium oxide, requires energy for processing. The biggest growth material in the zero emissions world will be pure silicon. The main active component in the silicon batteries and chips in solar panels, important in batteries, important in computers. That is mainly silicon oxide, sand or quartz, and a whole lot of energy plus some carbon, and those inputs need to be zero carbon inputs from now on. Where as the biggest exporter of these products, we're the natural place to add the renewable energy to turn them into products. The third big advantage is that we've got more land suitable for production of biomass as a zero emissions alternative to coal and gas and oil in chemical manufactures, and also for sequestering carbon in plants and soils. We've also got the technologies to make that conversion, and there was reference earlier by the Vice Chancellor to negative emissions. Well, a lot of work is being done on technologies for negative emissions, but there's one proven technology. It's got a proven track record that goes back many years, in fact about 1 billion years, and that's photosynthesis. And hundreds of millions of years of evolution of plants on this dry continent with its variable rainfall has led to acacias and eucalypts that are just very efficient at using a little bit of variable rainfall to convert biomass. Indigenous Australians knew and know a lot about making good use of that. Australian modern science is identifying ways in which that can be applied very productively to negative emissions in the zero carbon world. Our fourth big advantage is that the new world is going to require very large amounts of a number of minerals which were required in smaller amounts in the old world economy. These have come to be called recently critical minerals. Mike Sanderford, the former director of the School of Earth Sciences here at Melbourne, in his chapter in this book, calls them, I think more suitably, energy transition minerals, the essential components of the solar panels, the wind turbines, the batteries, the electric cars, the transmission cables that are going to be so important. Australia happens to be by far the world's largest depository of a wide range of these energy transmission minerals. Fifth advantage is that we've got the skills from the old forestry, agricultural, minerals, metallurgical industries to build the new economy. A lot of the things learnt, including a lot of the infrastructure built for the old economy, is a good base for moving on the new economy. This was emphasised in the Queensland Premier's very important statement on a new energy plan a week ago. Premier Palaszczuk talked about Queensland, not talking about Australia, talking about Queensland being a global energy superpower. Talked about in using the old legacy of skills and infrastructure from the coal and natural gas economy to build the new energy superpower. Really important statement, forward-looking statement. In my book Reset from 2021, I talked about a new national direct current electricity grid, and I called it the super grid. Well, she used the name super grid for the Queensland component of that. So in this book, I've called the national version of it the sun grid to distinguish it from the Queensland contribution. But the legacy of knowledge of infrastructure from the old economy is very important in the new. And the fact that coal and gas are so big and are going to be declining is actually a big help. If they stayed big, it'd be very difficult to get the capital and the skills to build all of the new things. It's actually a big help that coal and gas will be declining. We can do the important new things without inflationary pressures, without such great claims on resources. To take it, if we do things well, as I explain in the book, Australia will not only reduce global emissions by 1.25% by reducing its own emissions to zero, it will reduce global emissions by 7% by supplying zero emissions goods and carbon credits to other countries. And that is an immense contribution, because that 7% will contain a lot of the goods that would be particularly costly and difficult for the densely populated industrial countries of Northeast Asia and Europe to do on their own. I think it could be critical to whether or not the world succeeds. This is change for Australia on an immense scale, but change on a scale that we can manage. It would require 5.5% of our GDP to be invested in the new economy for 3 or 4 decades. Now, that's a lot of money, 125 billion, 5.5% of our GDP now. That'll become twice that by the middle of the century. But we invested at a peak about 12% of GDP in restructuring in the mining industry, to restructure our economy to supply the resources for the China resources boom during China's period of very rapid growth from 2002 to 2014. So we've made this sort of commitment of resources before, mainly private, and the new economy will be built mainly with private resources. The scale is actually within the range of the scale of the commitment to mining in Australia to supply Chinese mineral requirements during their period of rapid growth in the first 1.5 decades of this century. Huge changes in policy and administration, management of land, in community education. Also changes in attitudes to international trade, especially in other countries. The countries of Europe and Northeast Asia have to be comfortable about drawing zero emissions goods from Australia rather than making the steel themselves. One might say, especially given the state of Australia-China relations at the moment, that's impossible. It is impossible, but not as impossible as it was to get the Chinese Communist Party to accept reliance on Australia as a source of imports of iron ore beginning in the 1980s. They were the years I was ambassador, and one of my main jobs was to persuade the Chinese leadership and Chinese business that Chinese economy would perform very much better if it relied on high quality imported mineral ores, and as well as wool and grain. And I was well known for my explanation of the advantages for China of these things. Ran right against every instinct of Chinese policy at the time. We were coming out of Maoist autarky, where it was thought to be a matter of insecurity, of national insecurity, to rely on a foreign country, a capitalist country, for very large amounts of a crucial material like iron ore, the basis of heavy industry. But my efforts were respected, and they made me an honorary professor while I was ambassador of the Wuhan Iron and Steel University. And I gave my inaugural lecture there, in which I said, if China manages its reforms well, by the end of this century, China will be importing 100 million tons of high quality iron ore. And you'll get much better results than if you rely on self-sufficiency in very low grade iron ore, as you've done up till now. And 2 weeks later, Xinhua, the Chinese national news agency, ran a piece quoting the Premier. He didn't mention me or the Australian ambassador. He said, some foreigners say that China by the end of the century will be importing 100 million tons of iron ore. Those foreigners don't understand the Chinese situation. Well, China is now importing over 1 billion tons a year of iron ore. The shift from autarky in iron ore to imports of iron ore is a much smaller shift than the shift from imports of iron ore to iron metal. Of course, it's impossible, but nowhere near as impossible as that other change 4 decades ago. The changes will happen most smoothly and most easily through cooperation with Europe and Japan and Taiwan, but the biggest impacts will eventually be with China, and one should not think too much about current tensions in relations with China being the foundation of international relations forever. Remember that just 12 years after the Second World War, 14 years after the Japanese bombing of Darwin and Broome, we signed the trade agreement with Japan that offered most favored nation treatment to Japan, that made Japan our biggest trading partner in the 70s and 80s. History takes a long time. Let's recognize that international relations evolve, and the constraints of October 2022 will not be the same as the constraints in 10 and 20 years' time and 100 years' time when we're living within the zero emissions world economy. So 1.5 degrees is necessary. It's possible. Whether or not we make it, whether or not the world makes it, depends quite a lot on what Australia does diplomatically and in its own domestic management. It depends on us. It depends on us, again, seeing knowledge as the basis of important national policy. Let's see what we make of it.
Thanks very much, Ross. Terrific inaugural climate policy address. There are a whole range of things which we could draw from that, but I just want to touch on a couple of things. If John Donne, the famous English poet, was actually an IR, international relations expert, he'd be saying, no island is an island. The globalization which we have participated in clearly has delivered us a number of different versions of problems and opportunities. On the one hand, environmental globalization has delivered us the collective action problem of climate change. No one country can solve it. And therefore, our role in cooperating to resolve this problem is very important. And as Ross has stressed, I think very importantly and very rightly, Australia has had a disproportionate influence in a range of different ways. Power comes in different forms, political forms. It also comes in the forms of energy that we use. Australia has been a disproportionate contributor to global warming. If we set aside the contribution we've made with our domestic emissions and look at our embodied emissions through coal and gas, we're the world's biggest exporter of coal and gas. We're the 6th largest contributor to global emissions through the substances that we've exported as well as what we've burnt here. And therefore, we have a whole range of responsibilities. And I think Ross has outlined very positively the economic material capacities that we have to not only to redress what we have done, but also to provide globally a significant additional contribution beyond, punching beyond our weight, if one has to use those terms. Thanks very much, Ross.